Welcome to this Taylor Wessing webinar on the subject of data and market exclusivity in pharmaceuticals. My name is Paul England, and to discuss this topic, I'm joined by Manja Epping, who is a partner in Taylor Wessing's Munich office, and Edward Vickers, who is a senior counsel in our London office. Just before I start, I should just mention that you are welcome to send in questions using the option on your screens, and we will respond to you as soon as we can by email. Please also stay online for a moment at the end to fill out the short feedback form that will appear on your screens. So data exclusivity and market exclusivity. It's said often enough that there is a large price attached to the technology and expertise that goes into developing a medicinal product. Also, most would probably recognise that the highly regulated nature of the pharmaceutical sector makes compliance a significant cost, particularly generating the data required for the marketing authorization necessary to bring a product to market. The investment in development is intended to be protected by patents and supplementary protection certificates. But how is the investment in, for example, collecting clinical data to be protected and encouraged? The answer is actually various forms of data exclusivity, or otherwise known as regulatory data protection, and market exclusivity rights. These rights are additional to and independent of any granted patent exclusivity right covering a medicinal product, but their effect is often also a de facto monopoly for the medicinal products concerned. It's the forms of these rights, data exclusivity and market exclusivity, that we would like to explore in this webinar. And in particular, we're going to cover the following. Manja is going to talk about the basis and limitations of data and market exclusivity, and the extensions and standalone periods that are available in certain circumstances. Then Ed's going to talk about the concept of global marketing authorizations and market exclusivity for orphan medicinal products. And then I'll end with a short comment on the inescapable question of the moment. What impact might Brexit have on these rights in the UK? So I'd like to get started by handing straight over to Manja to explain how data exclusivity rights work and the circumstances in which they're available. Manja.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, the aim of pharmaceutical legislation in general is to strike a balance between a couple of competing interests. The legislator aims to offer rewards for the research and development for innovative new treatments, but the legislator also wants to allow generic competition that will bring down the overall cost of medicines. Furthermore, legislation must ensure that sufficient preclinical and clinical data are produced by the pharmaceutical companies to demonstrate that drugs are safe and effective. On the other hand, excessive and repetitive testing in humans should be avoided. And this reasoning applies in particular to the data exclusivity provisions. On the one hand, the innovator company is compensated for the investment it has put into developing a new medicinal product. On the other hand, market access is provided to generic competitors after a certain time. In the first part of this presentation, I will speak about the data and market exclusivity provisions in the Directive on Human Medicinal Products and the equivalent provisions in the regulation covering the centralized procedure. Later on, my colleague Edward Vickers will talk about market exclusivity under the Orphan drug regulation. And this is now how the regulatory data exclusivity provisions work. In order to obtain a marketing authorization for a medicinal product, the first applicant must provide a full dossier including the results of preclinical tests and clinical trials, and has to prove the sufficient quality, safety and efficacy of the product. A generic, so the second product is considered a generic if it has got the same qualitative and quantitative composition as the first product in terms of active substance, if it has the same pharmaceutical form, and if it is bioequivalent. If the product is a generic, the application may rely on the preclinical and clinical data of the reference product, that's the first application, but the generic company must still provide the full quality and CMC part of the dossier. In the procedure, the generic company only needs to demonstrate bioequivalence and the other conditions of being a generic. And even if the product is not bioequivalent, under certain circumstances, it can still refer to the preclinical and clinical data of the reference product, but must provide additional data, which are called bridging data, to prove a therapeutic equivalence. And this is called a hybrid application. We will see an example for this later on. Well, after a period of time, which is sufficient to reward investment in the data used, this reference to the innovate data can be made. So, how long is the exclusivity period and how is it calculated? The answer depends on when the application for the first medicinal product was filed. When the first MA was filed before the 20th of November 2005 using the centralized procedure, the period of data exclusivity was 10 years. That's the old data exclusivity regime. If the marketing authorization was filed before the 30th of October in 2005 with a national regulatory authority, so that meaning in a decentralized procedure, mutual recognition procedure, or national procedure, the period was 6 years or 10 years, depending on the member state. For example, the UK and Germany had a regime of 10 years, Austria and the CEE countries and some other countries of 6 years. This regime changed with the pharmaceutical legislation reform in 2004, so that according to the transitional provisions, marketing applications filed from the 30th of October or the 20th of November 2005, depending on whether it's a national authority or centralized procedure, now enjoy 8 years of data exclusivity, followed by 2 years of market exclusivity. It's also called the 8+2 regime. Now that raises the question, what's the difference between data exclusivity and market exclusivity? Data exclusivity means that a generic applicant may not make reference to the data, the preclinical and clinical data filed by the first applicant. This means that the regulatory authority is not allowed to even accept the generic application or to process it to marketing authorization. After this 8-year period, the application can be processed, but during the period of market exclusivity, the product, even if it has received authorization, cannot be marketed. This is only after the expiry of this additional 2 years. The exclusivity period starts running when the first marketing authorization within the EU is granted, and that means granted means a notification to the applicant, at least under the centralized procedure. It may be different under the national regimes of the member states. The new regime that I'm focusing on in this presentation, because the old regime is getting less and less important here, the new regime also provides for a possible 1-year extension. And this is the case if within the first 8 years of those 10 years of data and market exclusivity, the marketing authorization holder obtains an authorization for one or more new therapeutic indications which are held to bring a significant clinical benefit in comparison with existing therapies. So that works in the way that the extension by 1 year applies to the dossier as such, so to the product as such, not only to the new therapeutic indications. And it also means that the 1 year extension can only be granted once, regardless of how many indications will be authorized during this 8-year period. What is meant by a significant clinical benefit? This is explained in more detail in Commission guidance. Well, normally, if that's the first treatment for the indication and it brings benefit to patients, this would be regarded as a significant clinical benefit. And if other therapies already exist in the indication, then normally comparative clinical trials will be necessary to justify the significant benefit, which can consist in either greater efficacy, improved safety profile, or a major contribution to patient care. Under the new regime, there's also a standalone year of data exclusivity available for new indications which are developed for well-established substances. And the basis of this is Article 10, Paragraph 5 of the Directive 2001/83. It applies to well-established substances which have been in use for medical purposes for at least 10 years within the European Union. And the application must be accompanied with significant preclinical and or clinical studies. This 1 year data exclusivity applies only to the new indications, so the data, preclinical and clinical data filed to support this new indication, and it can be granted several times. So if several new indications are developed for a well-established substance, in theory, this 1 year can be granted several times. And also for the question of what constitutes a significant study, there's Commission guidance available, and usually it is said that one confirmatory clinical trial versus a suitable comparator in the new indication has to be filed, but more data than this may be required in the individual case. I should add that this standalone year is, as I said, a period of data exclusivity. By contrast, the 8+2+1 year for the additional indication, this is a period of market exclusivity. So we heard about the distinction between these two. There's also data and market exclusivity available for combinations of active substances. This is laid down in Article 10b of the directive. And the full 8+2 data exclusivity and market exclusivity is available regardless of whether the active substance has already been approved in its own right, and also regardless of whether an active substance has existing data exclusivity. But the full preclinical and clinical data must be submitted for the combination. So this just fits into the normal concept of data and market exclusivity, but to make it clear, it can also apply for combinations of active substances. There's another standalone period of data exclusivity available in the event that the classification of the pharmaceutical product changes. The medicinal products can be classified as either prescription only or non-prescription. The pharmaceutical company may want to switch from prescription only to non-prescription and can do this under certain circumstances by making an application to the authority and by providing significant preclinical or clinical test results. And if it does so, if it provides enough and sufficient important and significant data, then the data provided can also enjoy a 1-year period of data exclusivity, and it grants protection against the reference by another applicant to the data for the purpose of changing the classification of the same substance for the duration of 1 year. So it's limited to a certain purpose. As I said, it's a standalone period of protection, and it can be granted in addition to and independently from other data or market exclusivity periods that are provided for in the directive or the regulation. Before I hand over to Edward, I would like to discuss some of the recent case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union and also the English and German courts which relate to data and market exclusivity. So one question that was asked was whether data exclusivity can be provided for bridging data. You will recall from the beginning that in some cases the second applicant may make reference to data filed for the reference product, but also has to provide additional preclinical and or clinical data because the second product is not exactly a bioequivalent or is delivered via a different route of administration. That's the hybrid application, as we call it. And the question of whether such bridging data filed by the second applicant could enjoy protection on their own was the subject of a recent judgment of the High Court of England and Wales concerning an analgesic substance which is called buprenorphine. First of all, Schering-Plough applied for marketing authorization for its product Temgesic, which was administered in the form of a sublingual tablet. Later on, another company, totally independent, NAP Pharmaceuticals, made a hybrid application referring to the Schering-Plough product and also providing bridging data because the second product was administered via a transdermal patch. Now, later on, Sandoz made an abridged application for its own transdermal patch product under the name of Relatrans, for example, in Germany and also in the UK, and was granted marketing authorization in the UK. And NAP, so the company that provided the additional bridging data, they challenged the marketing authorization in the UK, saying that the additional data should enjoy protection via data exclusivity provision on its own. But the court said that Sandoz was entitled to rely on the bridging data, and no period of exclusivity was accorded to the bridging data. So this English judgment is very much in line with earlier case law of the EU Court of Justice, for example, in the Novartis case. But the specific aspect of the present case was that the bridging data was filed by a third company which is not related to the MA holder of the first marketing authorization. Another interesting aspect was raised in a quite recent decision of the Court of Justice of the European Union just 2 years ago in the case Olain Farm. Olain Farm managed to get its product Niromidine authorized in Latvia using the procedure under Article 10A of the directive based on well-established use. So substances with an established medicinal use within the EU must be used for medicinal use within the EU for at least 10 years. And if they have a recognized efficacy, and an acceptable level of safety, then the results of preclinical tests and clinical trials that are normally required for marketing authorization can be replaced by appropriate scientific literature, which is why it's also called a bibliographical application. And so it confers a derogation from the requirement of providing a full dossier. Only 3 years later, another Latvian pharmaceutical company obtained a marketing authorization for a generic of niromidine, using niromidine as a reference product. This was challenged before the Latvian courts, and the Latvian courts referred the case to the Court of Justice of the EU. And interestingly, the CJEU held that the marketing authorization based on well-established use could be used as a reference medicinal product for generic applications. The interesting question was whether this reference product then also enjoyed data and market exclusivity periods of 8+2 years. Well, while the Advocate General in his opinion said yes, that's the case, the court did not say explicitly whether or not this 8+2 years exclusivity was granted. At least in Germany, differing views are taken by legal authors here, and the German administrative courts, they tend to follow the Advocate General, saying yes, if it is used as a reference product, it can be even accorded the 8+2 exclusivity. Another interesting aspect of the case was that the court said that the holder of the marketing authorization to which reference was made has a right to judicial remedy against the generic marketing authorization under Article 47 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. It's not clear, and this is still under discussion, whether this right to judicial remedy is based on the right of data exclusivity or whether it's independent from that. So this will be an ongoing discussion. The last case I will be discussing is also interesting, Accord Healthcare versus Astellas. I should say in the beginning that data exclusivity only applies to marketing authorizations which are granted in accordance with European law, or also called the acquis communautaire, which is enshrined in Articles 6 and 8 of the directive, and which means that a full dossier, including the results of preclinical testing and clinical trials, needs to be provided before marketing authorization is granted. Well, in the Accord Astellas case, a cancer product, bendamustine, which was called ribomustine at the time, was marketed in Germany under transitional provisions based on the clinical use of the product in the former Eastern Germany, so the GDR. Under the transitional procedure, which is provided for in Section 105 of the German Medicinal Products Act, Astellas obtained a marketing authorization called Nachzulassung, which requires a full dossier. But it obtained only 2 indications of those it had applied for and challenged the refusal of a 3rd indication before the courts. Later on, Astellas changed its strategy and was no longer interested in the 2005 marketing authorization, but instead applied for a new marketing authorization in the decentralized procedure, which was granted in 2010 under the name of Levact. Astellas seemed to try to get rid of the first MA by saying it's not compliant with the Directive 2001/83, in particular because the MA included further conditions to remedy serious deficiencies in pharmaceutical quality. Well, if the statement had been correct that the MA was not compliant with the directive, then the 2005 marketing authorization would have to be disregarded, and the data exclusivity period would have only started in 2010. So Eckert would not have been able, the generic company would not have been able to obtain a marketing authorization in the abridged procedure in the 10-year countries in 2015 as it did. And in the 6-year countries, because the old regime applied, it was even already in 2011 when the first authorizations were granted. So because Astellas challenged the marketing authorizations for the generic products, Eckert and other generic companies in many European countries, Eckert applied to the English High Court and sought a declaration that the 2005 authorization was fully compliant with the directive, and it succeeded, among others, because the court said that the directive perfectly allowed the use of conditions, and that was not contrary to the acquis communautaire. Just want to add a German aspect to this case. So also in Germany, the authorization for the generic authorization for Eckert and other generic companies was granted at the end of 2015 and was challenged by Astellas in the German Administrative Court. First of all, in a preliminary procedure where because the German authority lifted the suspensive effect of the appeal, meaning that the generic products could enter the market. And this was confirmed by the administrative courts. The higher administrative court of Münster in the second instance said, it basically confirmed what the High Court had said the English High Court had said, and added an interesting aspect to the case by saying that the originator cannot base its challenge of the generic marketing authorization on alleged deficiencies in the quality dossier because no reference is made to the quality dossier. Reference by the generic companies is only made to preclinical tests and clinical trial results, but not to the pharmaceutical quality, because the generic application needs to present a full pharmaceutical quality dossier. Well, it's too early to say what will happen in the main proceedings. To date, we only have a preliminary ruling, but also this is a case that is worth following. And now I would like to hand over to my colleague Edward, who will talk about the concept of global marketing authorization.
Many thanks, Manja. So, as we've heard from Manja, data exclusivity prevents the use of preclinical and clinical data produced for the authorization of an earlier reference product for the subsequent purpose of approval of a generic version of that reference product. And the bar against reference to the data lasts for 8 years, but there is an additional 2 years preventing marketing of the generic, which amounts to 10 years market exclusivity overall. And as Manja also explained, exclusivity can be extended for new therapeutic indications and changes of classification. The question that I want to turn to is what exclusivity protection, if any, is available to the holder of the marketing authorization for line extensions to its original reference product. Is every modification to a product entitled to a new data exclusivity period? And this question is addressed by the concept of the global marketing authorization, which is provided for in Article 6.1 of the directive. And you can see the second subparagraph of Article 6.1 on the slide. It was added to the directive in the revisions made in 2004 and codified the position that had been decided in earlier case law. And it provides that when a medicinal product has been granted an initial marketing authorization in accordance with the first subparagraph, that is the first subparagraph of Article 6.1, which requires a party putting a medicinal product on the market to obtain a marketing authorization first, any additional strengths, pharmaceutical forms, administration routes, presentations, as well as any variations and extensions, shall also be granted an authorization in accordance with the first subparagraph, will be included in the initial marketing authorization. Importantly, all these marketing authorizations shall be considered as belonging to the same global marketing authorization, in particular for the purpose of the application of Article 10.1. And Article 10.1, as Manja explained earlier on, governs generic applications and the 8+2+1 data exclusivity regime. So Article 6.1 is saying that these various modifications belong to the same global marketing authorization for the purposes of figuring out the data and market exclusivity that applies to the product. And note also that Article 6.1 refers to a medicinal product, and that's something I'll come back to in a moment. So the scope of the global marketing authorization is also addressed in the European Commission's notice to applicants, and the relevant part of the notice is on the slide that you can see now. And the notice repeats some of what is set out in Article 6.1, as you can see from the bold wording, but what it emphasises is that the global marketing authorization concept is applied even where modifications result from separate regulatory procedures, or the modification is given a different name, including where the initial authorization was a national authorization and the subsequent authorization was granted through the centralized procedure. Now, I mentioned I'd come back to the words a medicinal product, and you might think that those words have the effect that where a new dose or indication or presentation is authorized for a medicinal product containing the same active ingredient as an earlier product, that it would be part of the same global marketing authorization. And of course, you would be absolutely right, as the recent case between Novartis and the Commission shows. And these were proceedings before the General Court of the European Union, and they concerned Novartis' product zoledronic acid. And in 2001, Novartis obtained a centralized marketing authorization for a medicinal product called Zamita, which contained 4 milligrams of zoledronic acid and was approved for certain bone cancer indications. And subsequently in 2005, Novartis obtained a separate centralized marketing authorization for a medicinal product called a cluster. And the cluster contained 5 milligrams of zoledronic acid and was indicated for the treatment of Paget's disease and later on also osteoporosis. Now, the old regime applied at the time to the zoledronic acid authorizations. So in 2011, 10 years after the Zamita authorization, there were generic applications filed which included both the 4 milligram dose for the cancer indications and the 5 milligram dose for the benign indications, Paget's disease and osteoporosis. And the EMA granted those marketing authorizations to the generic applicants. So Novartis challenged the decision and argued that a cluster should have a separate 10-year period of data exclusivity starting from the later date at which it was approved, a cluster that is, and therefore that the period had not yet expired when the generic applications were filed. And among other things, Novartis relied on the fact that to generate the clinical data required for the cluster dossier, it had to do what it said was more or less an entire clinical trial, because the 2 doses were used to treat completely separate patient groups, those with bone cancers on the one hand, and those with Paget's disease or osteoporosis on the other hand. And the General Court disagreed. It took the view that on the clear meaning of the wording of Article 6.1, the cluster approval was part of the same global marketing authorization as the earlier Zamita approval, and data exclusivity for both doses And all the approved indications have therefore expired in 2011, and the generic applications have been validly granted. And under the new regime, of course, there is a possible reward for the additional efforts that an innovator might have to make in identifying new indications. But it's the plus 1 year that Manja mentioned earlier on, not a whole new 10-year period. And the additional year is only available for new therapeutic indications, not strengths, pharmaceutical forms, administration routes, presentations, and so on, and only where it's shown to bring a significant clinical benefit. So where the active ingredient is identical, modifications are part of the same global marketing authorization. But what about where there are differences between the active ingredients of the earlier and later marketing authorization applications? Does that always mean that a new period of data exclusivity arises, or are there circumstances where the differences are not considered to be significant enough? And the notice to applicants provides some supplementary guidance using the concept of a new active substance. And according to the notice, a product will be assessed as a new active substance if it is a chemical, biological or radiopharmaceutical substance not previously authorized in a medicinal product in the European Union. So that's pretty clear. Secondly, an isomer, a mixture of isomers, a complex or derivative of a salt of a chemical substance previously authorized in a medicinal product in the European Union, but differing significantly in properties with regard to safety and or efficacy from the previously authorized chemical substance. Third, a biological substance previously authorized in a medicinal product in the European Union, but again differing significantly in properties with regard to safety and or efficacy. Those differences being due to differences in one or a combination of the molecular structure, the nature of the source material, or the manufacturing process. And finally, a radiopharmaceutical substance, which is a radionuclide or a ligand not previously authorized in a medicinal product in the European Union, or the coupling mechanism to link the molecule and the radionuclide has not been previously authorized in the European Union. So note that under the second and the third of those, unless the substance in question can be shown to be differing significantly in properties with regard to safety and or efficacy from the reference product, there's a presumption that it's a generic medicinal product falling within the global marketing authorization of the first authorized substance. And this means it would not be entitled to an additional period of data exclusivity protection. But there's still the question of how this is to be satisfied. And while the reference to isomers and salts is pretty clear, what does the notice mean when it talks about complexes and derivatives of previously authorized substances? Well, there's some further guidance that's also been issued by the EMA in the form of a reflection paper, which considers specifically whether an enantiomer, a complex, a derivative, or a different salt or ester should be designated as a new active substance in relation to the relevant reference active substance. And in particular, the paper sets out the following. First, the criteria to be applied in deciding on whether an active substance differs significantly with regard to efficacy and or safety compared to the relevant reference active substance. And these are to be examined on a case-by-case basis, but it's noted that the default position is that an enantiomer, complex, derivative, or a different salt or ester is not different from the reference active substance unless it's demonstrated to be. Secondly, the reflection paper sets out the type of evidence required to show differences, the most compelling of which, it says, is clinically relevant human safety and or efficacy differences, preferably shown in head-to-head clinical studies. And then finally, the reflection paper cites a number of factors that might constitute a significant difference in safety and or efficacy to justify new active substance status, in the form of evidence likely to be sufficient and evidence unlikely to be sufficient. For example, A decrease in dosing frequency is likely to be sufficient, but changes to pharmacokinetics alone are not likely to be sufficient. We can also get some assistance from illustrative examples of how the CHMP has decided in actual cases. And a leading example is S-zopiclone. And here, despite a re-examination, the CHMP decided that Seprocor's active substance, which was the enantiomer S-zopiclone, could not be regarded as a new active substance based on a comparison with its corresponding racemate zopiclone, which had already been on the market for many years. However, in another case concerning Obagio, also known as teriflunomide, which is pictured on the slide, the CHMP changed its opinion after re-examination to conclude that teriflunomide is a new active substance as compared to leflunomide, which you can also see on the slide. And in this case, teriflunomide is an active metabolite of leflunomide, and there are structural differences between the molecules, as you can see. And the CHMP stated that its decision was based on differences between teriflunomide and leflunomide as regards safety. And a third case in which the status of an active ingredient was re-examined by the CHMP is that of tecfidera, or dimethyl fumarate. And this was considered to be different from fumiderm, which was a combination of dimethyl fumarate with the calcium salt of ethyl fumarate, the magnesium salt of ethyl hydrogen fumarate, and the zinc salt of ethyl hydrogen fumarate. However, it's not quite clear how much of the decision had to do with the fact that fumiderm had not previously been the subject of a European Union-wide marketing authorization, as opposed to the compound only being one element of the earlier authorized combination. Okay, I'm going to move away from the provisions of the Medicines Directive now to the increasingly important matter of market exclusivity for orphan medicinal products, which is dealt with in the Orphan Medicinal Products Regulation, number 141 of 2000. And this regime is designed to encourage companies to develop new drugs and carry out research on existing drugs to treat rare diseases where the likely revenues available don't justify the research required. These are so-called orphan drugs. Amongst other incentives for the development of orphan drugs is a period of 10 years market exclusivity for the indication in question, following the grant of a marketing authorization for the product. And for a product to be classified as an orphan medicine, it must be intended for the diagnosis, prevention or treatment of either a life-threatening or chronically debilitating condition affecting no more than 5 in 10,000 people in the EU at the time of submission of the application for orphan designation, or a life-threatening, seriously debilitating or serious and chronic condition where, without incentives, it would be unlikely that the revenue after marketing of the medicinal product would cover the investment in its development. There must also be either no satisfactory method of diagnosis, prevention or treatment of the condition concerned, or if there is such a method already existing, the new medicine must be of significant benefit to those affected by the condition. And any company may apply to the EMA for their drug to be given an orphan designation in a separate application to an application for a marketing authorization. And orphan designations, in fact, can be obtained at any stage before an application for a marketing authorization is made, provided there's a proper scientific justification for it. If a drug is successfully designated as an orphan drug, it will be entered on the Community Register of Orphan Medicinal Products. Now, during the 10-year exclusivity period, no similar product to the designated orphan drug can be placed on the market for the orphan indication. The market exclusivity of 10 years available to an orphan drug may run in parallel with the basic marketing exclusivity if the drug's also authorised for other indications, and also any additional orphan indications for the same product also benefit from their own 10-year period of marketing exclusivity. And if an application for marketing authorisation for an orphan product includes the results of studies conducted in accordance with an agreed paediatric investigation plan, the 10-year period is extendable to a period of 12 years. So this is a powerful exclusivity right, and not surprisingly as a result, it's been challenged in the courts, most recently in the case of Teva and the EMA. And the Teva case concerns Novartis's drug imatinib, also known as Gleevec, which was granted orphan status and received a marketing authorization in 2001. And it therefore benefited from marketing exclusivity until 2011 for similar products for the same indication, which was chronic myeloid leukemia, or CML. Subsequently, Novartis developed another similar product called nilotinib, also known as Tasigna, which also received an orphan designation. Now, imatinib was already available for the treatment of CML, of course, so the nilotinib orphan designation was granted on the basis that it could provide significant benefit for the treatment of CML because it might improve the long-term outcome of the patients in comparison to the existing products, which, as I say, included imatinib. A marketing authorization for Tasigna, the nilotinib product, was granted in 2007 during the market exclusivity of Gleevec. And because the two products were similar medicinal products and they were both indicated for CML, it was necessary, as the regulation requires, for consent to be given for the authorization of Tasigna by the holder of the authorization for Gleevec. Now, of course, Novartis held both authorizations, so the consent was forthcoming. And the result of this is that the exclusivity period of Tasigna for CML doesn't expire until 2017, and so it was still in place at the time that Teva submitted a marketing authorization application for its generic imatinib. And the application was rejected by the EMA on the basis that imatinib is a similar product indicated for the same condition, chronic myeloid leukemia, as nilotinib. Now, Teva obviously disputed this and argued for the General Court that the second authorization for nilotinib as a similar second-generation product for the same indication was not entitled to a new period of market exclusivity. Otherwise, it argued, imatinib would effectively be getting an additional period of exclusivity amounting to another 6 years. The General Court dismissed Teva's claim and confirmed that the 10-year market exclusivity regime for orphan medicinal products is different from the 8+2 regime for data exclusivity and market exclusivity, in that it's an absolute bar to competing authorizations. And the court held that the regulator must not grant a marketing authorization for a similar product for the same indication as an orphan medicinal product during the 10-year marketing exclusivity period running from the grant of the orphan drugs marketing authorization. And this applies regardless of any product for which market exclusivity may have expired, such as imatinib. And the court justified this by referring to the purpose of the regulation, the orphan drugs regulation, that is, as an encouragement to investment in research and development of orphan medicinal products. Lastly from me then, Teva then appealed the decision of the General Court and appealed to the Court of Justice. And among the arguments made by Teva were that the General Court's finding would be at odds with the purpose of the orphan drugs regulation, because it would in effect prolong the market exclusivity of the initial product beyond 10 years. But the Court of Justice held that the only provision for reducing the duration of the marketing exclusivity of an orphan product is contained in Article 8.2 of the Orphan Drug Regulation. And this provision only applied where the product no longer satisfied the conditions required of an orphan product in the regulation. And there is no other basis for curtailing the market exclusivity of the second product. So the Court of Justice therefore upheld the decision of the General Court. Okay, that's all from me. I will now hand back to Paul to conclude with a note on Brexit.
Thank you, Ed. Yes, indeed. Amongst the many questions raised by the Brexit vote on the 23rd of June 2016 is, of course, the impact of the UK leaving the EU on the regulatory regime governing data exclusivity, as well as the other exclusivity rights that we've been discussing in this webinar. In purely legal terms, the impact of Brexit on the UK specifically depends on whether the law at issue is laid down in an EU directive or an EU regulation. Regulation is a legislative instrument that has what is called direct effect, which means that it's automatically applicable in all the EU member states as soon as it comes into force, without the need for national implementing legislation. So contrast that with directives, which are legislative instruments that set out harmonising standards for national law, but aren't themselves directly effective. Instead, directives are enacted by the member states in national legislation in a manner which is open to their own discretion, which means that the national law can end up slightly different or somewhat different from one country to another. So an example of that is the statutory instrument called the Human Medicines Regulations 2012, number 1916, that implements in the UK one of the directives we've been talking about, 2001/83, concerning the 8+2+1 regime of data and market exclusivity for marketing authorisations obtained through the member state authorities. As UK legislation, this will remain in force after the UK leaves the EU. But compare it to regulations, which after the much discussed period of 2 years from the triggering of Article 50, will no longer have legal force in the UK. And this is, of course, relevant to the Orphan Medicinals Products Regulation 141/2000, which Ed has been explaining. If the rights afforded by this regulation is to be continued, it will need to be replaced in UK law in time for the 2-year exit period to run out. And indeed, it's because of regulations like this that the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, announced on the 2nd of October that a Great Repeal Act would come into force to implement in UK law that EU law, including regulations, necessary to ensure a smooth transition immediately after Brexit has effect. So assuming that regulation's included, it will then be important to see to what extent, if at all, the key terms of the orphan drug legislation is amended according to the UK's own agenda. Nonetheless, the potential impact of Brexit on all forms of EU-wide marketing authorisation procedure and the exclusivity rights attached to them still needs some more consideration. And this is because these procedures require cooperation and mutual recognition between member states. It's hoped that the need for duplicate authorisations between the UK and the EU are going to be avoided after Brexit. But this is going to depend upon the negotiations between the UK and the remainder of the EU after Article 50 has been triggered, and the nature of the UK's relationship with the EU once the UK leaves. But for now at least, the UK authority, the MHRA, which is also very heavily involved in EU-wide marketing authorisations generally, is saying that taking a full active role in European regulatory procedures for medicines remains a priority. But of course, as with all Brexit questions at the moment, it has to be emphasised that it's very early days in the new era that began on the 23rd of June, and it is difficult to predict with any certainty what is going to happen in the coming months. So for some time yet, matters will continue as my colleagues have described them in this webinar. Now, that concludes our webinar for today, but we'll be saying much more about the impact on Brexit, on the life sciences in particular, in a webinar next year. So please look out for that. We have a couple of email questions that we'll address by email after we finish. And it just remains for me to thank you for joining us. And please stay logged on just for a moment to answer our feedback questionnaire. That's greatly appreciated, and it helps us determine what sort of subjects and what sort of changes we should make going forward with webinars for you. For now, goodbye and thank you.